Hello and welcome. My name is Dalia Habib Linssen. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Academic Engagement at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. On behalf of my collaborators, I want to thank you for joining us for this Artist Student Curator program that welcomes participants to learn how the look, feel, and interpretation of the museum's galleries are shaped by contemporary artists, students, and MFA staff. As we switch to the next slide, before the program begins, we would like to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts, founded in 1870, stands on a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and our programming. We should note that this land acknowledgement is actively being discussed and reevaluated to be a more actionable statement that reflects our current commitments and collaborations. With a couple of housekeeping notes here before we begin the program, as indicated in no uncertain terms by this slide, the program is being recorded and we anticipate that it will be available as a recording sometime this year, and that when the recording is taking place, you're welcome to turn off your video and mute your audio, but the majority of the recording will only show the presenters actively speaking. On the next slide, you'll see a few tips for how to activate the transcript and closed captions for this program that are available through Rev for Zoom Live. And you'll see to enable closed captions at the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll click the up arrow next to closed caption and click the show subtitle to start displaying Rev for live captions. During the sessions, we invite questions and comments through Zoom's chat or raise hand functions. We would like to offer our deepest gratitude to Sophia Walter for her extraordinary support and organization for today's program. And we encourage you to please write in the chat should you need any help at all for today. In the next slide, we'll see an overview of our program for this evening, which is a continuation of a program that we first launched in the summer of 2020. In it, we explore specific objects, exhibitions, or programs from a range of perspectives. And in doing so, we seek to amplify the viewpoints of contemporary artists, college and university students, as well as MFA staff across many departments, to learn about the collaborative nature of work in museums and to foster dialogue among communities of artistic production, academia, and the MFA. For this session, I'm really excited that we're going to be exploring the development of an upcoming exhibition, Hear Me Now, The Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. This is an exhibition that will be opening in early March. So we offer tonight a kind of sneak preview and an opportunity for the academic community to consider incorporating the exhibition and related resources in their planning for the coming or the current semester, the spring semester. So the way that our program will be structured will be a panel discussion. We'll begin with Ethan Lasser, the John Moores Cabot Chair of the Art of the Americas Department, who will offer an overview of the exhibition. That will be followed by Boston College student, a senior actually, and former intern, Josephine Kim, who will present on some really compelling research that she's contributed to the exhibition's interpretation. Our third presentation will be from Michael Bramwell, the Joyce Linde Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art in the Art of the Americas Department, who will explore the poetics of resistance in the works by David Drake of Old Edgefield. So following our presentations, we'll have some time for question and discussion. And with that, I am really thrilled to turn it over to my great colleague, Ethan Lasser. Ethan, when you're ready.
Thank you. Thanks, Dalia. Great to see everyone. Thank you for being here. And really happy to have my collaborators, Josephine, who was my partner in crime at working at the MFA this fall as an intern, and Michael Bramwell, who he and I co-authored an essay for the exhibition catalog and are now happily colleagues in the Art of the Americas department here at the MFA. And I'm happy to welcome you to Hear Me Now, the Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. Here's a view of the exhibition as it's presented for just a few more days at the Metropolitan Museum in New York before it comes to Boston, to the MFA, where it opens on March 4th. And if you take anything from this talk, I hope you'll take an open invitation to come see the show and to reach out to me or Josephine or Michael to walk through together, because these objects, these ceramic vessels, are objects that open up through collective looking and conversation. Let's go to the next slide. So I'll tell you a bit about this story. First, to introduce the other members of the curatorial team who are not here. Adrian Spinozzi at left, who is associate curator and an expert in ceramics from the Met, and my colleague Jason Young, who is a historian of African-American history at the University of Michigan and professor of history there. And you'll see that we're number 2, stop 2 in a national tour, and the object will, the checklist, rather, the show will have the same objects, but look rather different in each museum. We can go ahead. As a curatorial team, we've spent many years in this project thinking about these objects, and our work has taken us many times to the site where they were made, to Edgefield, South Carolina, a rural area on the western side of the state, where we've learned about history, met with collectors, met with descendants of the potters, and expanded the ranks of our curatorial team. And this project is very much about shared platforms, shared voices. So here we are in Edgefield with some of our collaborators there, each of whom has a presence and made their mark in the show. And we can go ahead. And the show has also been shaped by the artists and scholars, archaeologists and historians who've contributed either as exhibition catalog authors or audio guide contributors, all of whom have shaped our thinking in many ways. So I just want to acknowledge at the top all of the people who are co-authors of this project. And there's one more slide to that end. And this is specifically to acknowledge the many people here at the Museum of Fine Arts who have contributed not just in their day jobs, but rather as a kind of advisory group in shaping how this show should look and feel here in Boston in the spring of 2023 at the MFA. And so I'm grateful for our many colleagues and outside local voices as well. And now let me tell you a bit about the content of the exhibition. Go ahead. So we're focusing in this show on a period from about 1820 to 1870 on the ceramics made, as I say, in the rural area on the western side of South Carolina. And the show offers, opens a window into the history of art and the history of slavery, because all of these objects were made with unequivocally attributed to the hand of enslaved people. We tend to think of the history of slavery, we're taught to think of it in terms of agriculture, cotton and tobacco. But in fact, these objects are tied to the history of what historians like Jason and others call industrial slavery, where skill and material knowledge and artisanal knowledge was prime. These objects were made in really proto-factory environments. And what they were refrigeration, were storage vessels for food, for meat, for molasses, for grain. And they spread across South Carolina and Georgia, where they were used to feed the huge enslaved labor forces that supported cotton and tobacco plantations. So you have to imagine all of the food necessary to support a growing population of enslaved people, and you need ceramics to keep that food fresh, protected from pests. And all of these objects come from one area in South Carolina. And the production of these vessels over the course of more than a half century, numbering in the tens of thousands, is entirely contingent on the knowledge and expertise of the enslaved potters who shared that knowledge and expertise over the course of generations. So let me get into some of the objects you see here. We can go ahead a slide. Here's where we are. And the reason this industry takes shape here is really threefold. One is there are ample deposits of clay in the Savannah River watershed, and potters and artists have worked that clay well beyond the 19th century for generations. In fact, our show opens with a vessel made in the 15th century by an indigenous potter from this region. The second reason is transportation. You're on a river, as you can see, the Savannah River going down to the ocean, and on eventually on a railroad, which makes it easy to move these vessels to markets near and far. And indeed, we find them across Georgia, in the record books, across South Carolina, in North Carolina, spreading throughout the South. And of course, the third and maybe most obvious reason for this happening in the South at this period, in addition to natural materials and transportation networks, is the presence of the enslaved potters and also their knowledge and expertise. And you won't be surprised to know that this industry is so contingent on that system and the system of exploiting people that after emancipation, it very quickly dies out. So we can go ahead. Here's some of the clays still present and harvestable today. We can go ahead. Thank you, Sophia. And in many ways, the star of the project, and a name that some people on this call might know, is Dave, or David Drake. And our knowledge of Edgefield is often tied to Dave, who was one of, we've determined, hundreds of people involved in the potting industry, but is perhaps best known because he signed, dated, and inscribed verses onto monumental storage jars like this one seen installed at the Met. And we can go ahead and I'll tell you a bit about Dave's story, but also our efforts to expand that story. So let me put you into the world of South Carolina in 1834. One of Dave's rather unique and surprising, and for historian enormously helpful aspects of his work is his tendency across some 40 years to sign and date month, day, year each vessel he made. So you see that here at right, 12 June 1834, and there at left, a much later vessel, August 22nd, 1857. And we can talk about why that is and what those dates might mean, but it creates a body of work. And in 1834, Dave, born around 1801, is inscribing his first vessel with the word concatenation, a word which is a word that poets use when they talk about the linking together of separate parts, concatenating the verses of a poem. And the reason I highlight this piece for you is, first of all, we could talk about what the significance of that word, but we might also talk about the world of 1834, because just a few months after this pot is dated and inscribed, South Carolina clamps down on literacy and issues more punitive laws, punishments for both enslaved people and in white people teaching enslaved people to read and write. So in the shadow of what is becoming a criminal offense in the state laws, Dave is visibly, conspicuously inscribing these objects, and he goes on to do that with more and more verses over the course of the next decades. And you can see the verses range from, here's one in our collection. I made this jar for cash, though it's called lucratrash. They're ironic. There's no sense in this case that the enslaved poet was actually being paid for his work. his work went to the LM, who's Lewis Miles, his enslaver. The cash went there. And Lucre Trash is an example of one of the many things, one of the many intertextual moments of Dave's poetry where he's referring, as he often does, to biblical verse. So we have these clay monuments inscribed with verses that are often looking outward to other kinds of writing in this moment. We can go ahead. I'll just share some of the poems, which I know Michael will talk about more deeply. Here's an example of, or a close-up of the first pot, concatenation, and I show it to call attention not only to the presence of the word and the date, but to the penmanship. Those of you who know your 19th century history will know that penmanship was often read as an index of character, and Dave's penmanship is immaculate and clearly a very well trained and educated hand. We can go ahead. The other part of Edgefield that we highlight, in addition to Dave and the work of many potters around him, are these objects, which are called face vessels. And these objects exist outside the market, so they're not tied to that system of railroads and rivers that I discussed. They're made by enslaved people for their own use, tucked secretly into the kiln. They're small scale, they're handheld objects. And we know this because many of the objects descend in Black families. They're found in the 20th century in the North, and we know this from period records as well. They're often ornamented, as here, with eyes, noses, teeth, and with kaolin clay. That's the white clay. So you're seeing a stoneware body and kaolin additions. And we can go ahead. I'll just give you a sense of the prolificness of this body of objects, the numbers that we've found. These won't all be in the show, but they give you a sense of the number of face vessels that were being made and the many hands, because you can track different hands in these groupings, the many hands behind them. And all from Edgefield. What's less clear, if we can go ahead a slide, is what really these objects were for, right? We can say with certainty the big pots were for storing meat and grain. But one of the ideas we're opening up in our exhibition is connecting these objects to African diasporic traditions, and particularly religious and spiritual traditions associated with objects like this Nkisi figure from West Africa, which will be in the show. Kaolin, a sacred material in West African religious and spiritual practice. And for various reasons, we position or argue that the face vessels are not, as they've often been dismissed, alcohol jugs or water jugs, but were rather central to diasporic spiritual and religious traditions in the New World, in many ways versions of the Nkisi for the enslaved people of South Carolina. We can go ahead. And the final kind of chapter of the project that I'll just introduce and we'll be including the work of some, I think, 5 living artists in the show. And it's one of the distinctive parts about this project for me that these weren't, many times museums goes out to an artist and says, like, can you respond to a historic work? That's not the case here at all. Rather, these artists rather are building knowledge alongside us as historians who are part of this team. So in many ways, Theaster Gates introduced the work of Dave to the contemporary art world in this 2011 project from Milwaukee, which I had the good fortune to work on as a young curator, where Gates put Dave's poems to music. And you can see that performance at right, and we'll be showing a version of that performance here at the MFA in the show in film. We can go ahead. Introduce you just to some of the other artists who will feature in the show now, who are looking back and amplifying and complicating the Edgefield story. Simone Leigh, Robert Pruitt, Woody Diathello, all thinking about face jugs and the meaning of those vessels, and with Robert is a draftsman, but the other artists are all ceramicists. We can go ahead. We often think of Dave's work as monumental, and it is for its time. Huge pots, 28 gallons, hundreds of pounds of clay. But Simone Leigh hand-built this 5-foot vessel for the show called Jug, which takes inspiration and really magnifies, scales up an Edgefield face vessel, this object at right, covering it not in eyes and teeth, but in kaolin, white slip, and cowrie shells to gesture toward those connections I've discussed. And we can go ahead. And then I'll introduce you to one last contemporary artist named Bumi Gadebo, who's been central to our thinking as we've gone along with this project and interpreted the historic vessels. Bumi is an artist who can trace her own family lineage to the True Blue plantation near Edgefield in South Carolina. And she goes and digs clay from the site of True Blue, where her ancestors were enslaved, and makes vessels that out of that clay to commemorate her own history. And 2 notes here: the titles of these, KS and In Memory of Pierce McCrory, are taken from headstones on a family burial plot that was really untended, unkept, disregarded until Bumi started to care for it. And then the objects you can see hold human hair, and at right, rice. And rice was the crop of the True Blue plantation. So these objects for me are meaningful for many reasons. For one thing, they make me think about the way the Edgefield potters raised the question of how the Edgefield potters thought about their material and the memory and the bodies embedded in it, which is what Bumi's called attention to. So I think do I have any more slides? I think I'll end. Oh yeah, one more chapter to this brief overview of the project. This, a more recent development. What I'm showing you here is a image of the descendants of Dave, his 5 great grandchildren, so great, and they were recently here in Boston, looking at a Dave pot with us, thinking about the project. And I'll just say that their voices will be featured in our show in a very important and prominent way. And they have a lot to say about their ancestor and what it means today to think about and look at these pots in the museum setting. So I think I'll end with this image from earlier in January and turn it over to Josephine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Josephine Kim, and I am a senior at Boston College studying art history. First, I would like to extend a big thank you to Dalia for inviting me to join this panel, and to Sophia for organizing this for us. So during the fall of 2022, I had the pleasure of interning as an exhibition interpreter with Ethan, who is my mentor for the Hear Me Now exhibit. Today, I'll be sharing my research that primarily focused on telling and constructing the human stories that lived alongside the Edgefield stoneware. These are objects of history that bore witness to slavery and its aftermath. Therefore, in my presentation today, I hope to communicate that the Edgefield stoneware were inseparable from the violence, suffering, survival, and endurance of the unnamed potters who created them. The Edgefield stoneware took on many different forms, shapes, and sizes. This is a gallery view of the Hear Me Now exhibit at the Met, but I included this image to show the various scales of the different stoneware. These stoneware served multiple utilitarian functions, and they were also commodified to be sold by the gallon in a widespread market. Stoneware that were sold by the gallon would be marked with a number. For example, this churn and jug are labeled with the number 3, which signifies their capacity to hold 3 gallons. 4 main utilitarian shaped stoneware were the churn, pitcher, jug, and storage jar. These ceramic stoneware served as effective vessels to preserve and protect food and liquids from pests or spoilage. Especially in the summer when there was no refrigeration, these stoneware would provide cooling and protection from light, which would have spoiled its contents very quickly. The churn, identifiable by its cylindrical shape, varied in size, typically between 2 to 5 gallons. It was used to make butter, prepare other dairy products, or for pickling. The pitcher, which has a pouring spout, may have sat at the dinner table and was used to serve beverages. The jug has a body that tapers into a narrow rim. It was used to store or hold liquids such as water, whiskey, or vinegar, and syrups like molasses. Finally, the storage jar, which will be the main focus of my presentation today, had a wider rim, commonly accompanied by 2 or even 4 handles on its body. Storage jars, as its name implies, stored and preserved salted or pickled fruits, vegetables, and meats. They were covered or sealed with either a piece of cloth or melted wax to protect the food. Now I want to discuss Ration Day to set the scene for the following discussion on how enslaved workers supplemented their diets. Ration Day or Allowance Day was a day when enslaved workers would receive their very meager rations of food. This occurred typically once a week, and rations were distributed using different systems. Some plantations would distribute them per family, while others distributed them per individual. A common ration was a peck of cornmeal and 3 to 4 pounds of salted pork. Frederick Law Olmsted, an American landscape architect, noted in his travels to South Carolina in 1853 to 1854, the allowance is a peck of cornmeal or an equivalent quantity of rice per week to each working hand, old or young. And on the left is an image from an 1867 titled Ration Day from a series of illustrations in a newspaper of scenes on a cotton plantation. In the image, there's a scale to possibly measure the weights of the ration and a pig on the ground. And you can see young kids, men and women all lined up to receive their rations, and one white man stands over the supply of food. Enslaved workers commonly received the fattier cuts of the meat, and salt was a way to preserve and season these less desirable cuts. In some cases, however, there was also a myth that fresh meat contributed to disease, and therefore plantation owners considered salted meat to be better for the workers' diets. I want to continue this discussion with this jar in our minds that Dave or David Drake inscribes on the top with, "When you fill this jar with pork or beef, Scott will be there to get a piece." Even in conditions of inadequate food and what may seemingly appear as a lack of control with what was happening with their diets, enslaved workers were resourceful and active contributors to the production of their own food. In their free time, either when it was very early in the morning or very late at night after all of their labor was finished, enslaved workers turned to hunting, foraging, and gardening to supplement their rations of cornmeal and salted meat. They hunted nocturnal animals like possums and foraged greens like garlic and chives. In their garden, they grew vegetables such as beans, squash, yams, melons, and potatoes. And before I continue, I want to take the time to acknowledge that it is impossible to convey the extent of the dishes that emerge from the foodways of the enslaved workers in this very short presentation. In addition, very little cookbooks existed in this period that were written by Black chefs, especially from the South, because many enslaved workers were not taught how to read or write. Therefore, the existence of written recipes that I used for my research reflect power, just as the poems of Dave's or David Drake's jars. Therefore, the few recipes that I name here equally serve as evidence that even in the limiting conditions of oppression, enslaved workers asserted control over their food production to make it uniquely their own. To expand on that point, Abby Fisher was a former enslaved cook from South Carolina. After the Civil War, she moved to San Francisco with her family, where she became an award-winning chef and widely recognized for her Southern recipes in her local community. In 1881, she published her cookbook, What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking. Abby Fisher did not know how to read or write, but a group of friends and supporters helped her transcribe her recipes into print. The cookbook, however, did not gain much attention until 1984, when a volume was put up for auction. The cookbook was then reprinted in 1985 and again in 1995. An example of a recipe that comes from her cookbook is plantation cornbread or hoe cake. She says to put a half tablespoon of lard to a pint of meal, 1 teacup of boiling water, stir well and bake on a hot griddle. Sift in meal on teaspoonful of soda. I want to note that lard was actually a very common ingredient to many recipes. Turning to other cookbooks, lard was also known as cracklings, which were small pieces of pork fat that have been fried until all grease was removed, and they were either eaten on its own or often mixed with cornmeal to make crackling bread. And in this recipe, 2 of the main ingredients are 2 cups of cornmeal and 1 cup of broken cracklings. Another dish is the hopping john, which shows how enslaved workers would have used both their rations and supplements to create a dish using the ingredients that they had available. The black-eyed peas and onions would have come from their gardens, the garlic, parsley, and herbs from foraging, and finally the bacon or salt pork and rice from their rations. And again, to return to the storage jar with Dave's or David Drake's inscription, we can see that the ingredients themselves that were stored in these jars came from a long and complex culinary history that is built into the stories of the Edgefield stoneware. The ingredients stored in these jars were a way through which enslaved workers could exercise control and choices over their lives. The stoneware and foodways tell the stories of unnamed potters and enslaved workers who were forcibly displaced, suffering one of the worst social injustices of mankind, but nevertheless adapted to their new environments and produced recipes even with the poorest quality of ingredients, creating a sense of family and community within themselves. The foodways and culinary history of the enslaved people continue to permeate both the African American community and our society at large. Documentaries like High on the Hog continue to grapple with the challenge of reclaiming the traditions of African American culinary identity. And contemporary chefs like Ghetto Gastro celebrate the heritage of African American cooking and foodways with recipes that transform many Southern dishes into healthier alternatives. And perhaps alongside the Edgefield stoneware, we too can continue to celebrate the long enduring legacy of one of the most influential foodways of the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josephine. Michael, when you're ready, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll have the first slide. But if you ever find yourself lost and surrounded by enemies who won't let you speak in your own language, who destroy your statues and instruments, who ban your boom, ba-boom, you're in trouble, deep trouble. When the late African-American poet Amiri Baraka wrote those lines, he wasn't necessarily referring to David Drake. He was referring to all people that live and work under oppression. And what I'd like to offer for consideration this evening is David's jars offer us an insight or picture, if you will, into what the conditions were under which he worked and lived. And I would suggest also for us to take a look at his language, because language was the way in which he determined his ontological status as a human being. And we will see this as we move through. But what I'd like us to do this evening is look through the jars, not just at the jars, because there's a lot of discussion about how they looked and the size of the jars. But what I'd like us to consider this evening is to look through the jars to see what they disclose about the conditions under which he lived and worked. Next slide, please. One of the things that really became important in the South was that in order for the system of enslavement to work effectively, it was necessary, first and foremost, to dehumanize the enslaved population. And one of the ways that was done, and it was done in, I should say, in relation to the Stonewall Rebellion, was that they decided really early, after they got spooked by many enslaved people who decided to claim their liberty, they decided to put some laws in place, commonly known as slave codes. And those slave codes did a couple things to dehumanize. The first thing they did was they prevented assembly of people together. No more than two enslaved people could be in proximity to each other. The next thing they did was they prevented movement. You could not leave your plantation without written permission, and so forth. But one of the most curious things that the slave codes did is they banned literacy. They realized that one's ontological status as a human being is affected if you do not have literacy. According to David Hume, the Danish philosopher, it's literacy that determines our humanness and separates us from animals. So it was a way of othering, if you will, early on by saying, look, enslaved people can't read, they can't write, and therefore they must be part of the animal kingdom, or chattel, if you will. So these slave codes, that was one of the effectiveness of them. But I would suggest to you that David was doing more with language than we have yet to realize. He was enslaved, working, I guess, sun up to sundown in a pottery shack. And if you can only imagine the temperature in South Carolina in the summers, he's working in that shack, could not move, he had no freedom of movement, and so forth. Next slide. But what he's doing is he's responding, and I want us to keep this in mind, because when we go through the exhibition and we read these words, we have to understand what David was doing in the context of being enslaved. He wasn't a weekend potter, you know, at the wheel. This was an industrial enslavement operation. So we have to keep that in mind. So he writes his first word, concatenation. So just from writing the word alone, it indicates that he's achieved literacy. He's gotten around those slave codes that prevented literacy, I should say. And he's able to now say something, but he's saying it with a peculiar word, concatenation. For an enslaved person to have that kind of vocabulary means that he's intentionally doing something with language. And that's one of the things I want us to look at today, because I submit to you that one of the things that he was doing was he was talking about the mentalities of the people and the conditions under which he worked. So what does concatenation mean? It means linking together of separate parts. But what does that mean? In order to really understand it, we go back to context. What was happening? What was another behavior that was causing dehumanization? And that was family separations, right? Families were being sold off, next slide please, from each other at auction. And so David said, just by stating the word alone, it had sort of a performative effect, right? These separated families needed to be kept, if nowhere else, but in mind. And if we know the history and the social biography of these objects, they traveled, right? After David made them, they didn't stay in his shack, his pottery shack, or on his pottery plantation. They went to other plantations, as was indicated, and they were used for food storage and preservation. So one of the things he says again on another poem in 1857, I wonder where is all my relations, friendship to all in every nation. And many people get hung up on the poetics of that, what that means. But if you look at what James C. Scott talked about as the hidden transcript, what is he talking about? He's saying someone has sold my family, and I wonder where they are. So when we look at, he's really critiquing and indicting and looking at the history of mentalities of these people that are enslaving him. But remember, he's doing this in a poetic way. He can't come right out like the slave narratives did and critique the enslaver, because those folk were in the North and they had already escaped, and now they had the leisure of and the protection, quasi-protection of critiquing enslavers. Next slide. The 4th of July is surely come to blow the fife and beat the drum. Now, when I first read this and I read some of the commentary about this, people were implying that David was patriotic. And perhaps he was patriotic, but was he? Was he saying something else? When we think about this particular poem, and we think about revolution, and we think about tyranny, and we think about oppression, this was the rallying cry for saying, it's time to blow the fife and beat the drum. Now, who was he talking to? It's very important that we situate David's writing within the context of other writers at the time. Not in 1859, but in 1829, we have David Walker's Appeal, and he put that out at that time. You had Frederick Douglass writing. So when you position David around the kinds of events that were going on in the antebellum South at the time, one begins to look at this language as a type of resistance. Next slide. Frederick Douglass sort of gives us the sort of counter for those that say that David was really writing about patriotism, right? He says, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. So for those that say, oh, how cheery and nice that poetry is, and tend to focus on the size and aesthetic values of those jars, David was doing much more with language, I submit to you. Next. If you look really closely in 1859, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, and many of his followers were enslaved people who also were trying to claim their freedom, but by physical means. And I think this is one of the things that really sets David apart from other abolitionists at the time. David was actively involved, and if you read his poetry really closely, in a spiritual dimension. He was trying to change his enslavers, change their hearts, if you will, as a way of ending enslavement. While other people like John Brown and Nat Turner, they took a more counter-violent approach, like violence for violence. You know, you kill me, I kill you until all of us are dead, actually. But David was functioning at a higher, more spiritual level, trying to change his enslavers. Next slide, please. If you read David's text really closely, one of the most significant things for me that he talks about is this notion of repenting or you will be lost. The repenting is, as we know, a Christian concept. That means whatever you have done wrong, you can, by the grace of God, receive forgiveness for what you've done and begin to turn your life around, or as the Christians like to say, be born again. And David took this approach. But if you look really closely at David's Walker's appeal that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that he says in his Article 3, "O America, O Americans, I call God, I call angels, I call men to witness that your destruction is at hand and will be speedily consummated unless you repent." There's the repent again. So you have this abolitionist talking about repenting from the original sin that was enslavement. And you have David saying the same thing in one of his pot poems: repent or you will be lost. So you must situate David within the context of these writers who were all trying to achieve the end of enslavement, but in a different way. And I would suggest to you two things. One is that keep in mind when you read these poems, when you go through the exhibition, David is really bearing witness, because we're in 2023 and we're still talking about these vessels that were made in the 19th century. And so I want you to remember the words, but not for what they are, but for what they're doing. They're really performative. They're performing a function. And part of that function is to get us to look at the context in which he worked under and which he lived under. And I think if we do that, we'll have a wider understanding of this man and his material productions. Next slide, please. This is what he leaves us with, not only today, but in the 19th century. "I made this jar all of cross. If you don't repent, you will be lost." And I think many of these words have much application in the 19th century as much as they do in the 21st. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Josephine, and thank you, Ethan. It's really, really fantastic to have those different perspectives on this material. Michael, I'm really struck by your encouragement and notions around seeing, in some ways, through the pots, through the language, as a way of understanding deeper issues around context, which makes me wonder about the kind of like the current landscape in South Carolina, in this part of South Carolina, with regard to the shards of pots that would remain there. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that before we open it up to Q&A. Or Ethan or Josephine.
Yeah, a couple
about like
summers.
the then and now.
Oh, sure. A couple summers ago, I was with Ethan and some curators from the Met, as well as Dr. Jason Young. And it was an emotional experience for me, because we actually visited the landscape on which these pots were made. And literally the shards were underfoot as we were walking through. And I remember telling my wife, I visited this wonderful property where this manufacturing took place. And she said to me, "Oh, so you were on a plantation?" And it made me like really reflect, because I was like, when you think of enslavement, you think of cotton, picking cotton. Well, this was cotton picking by other means, if you will. And these jars represent that cotton, if you will.
It's really powerful. And to think about the kind of audio quality of being in that space, and the sound, I think, of the shards perhaps beneath your feet, and the significance of that experience that puts you back in that context, as you were suggesting. So thank you. Well, we
Yeah,
are really, oh, sorry, go ahead,
no,
Ethan.
I just wanted to share one more thought about that visit. And I think there's this project, like, unlike other artists in the history of this period in American art, there's just so much more to be learned. And when you go to these sites and you see what are called waster piles, where when you wood fire, when you wood fire a kiln, it's almost inevitable that you lose about 20% of the pots inside it, that they explode, because you can only control the distribution of heat so far. And so they just pitch them. And some of those piles still have not been really like sorted through by archaeologists. There's inscribed pots have been found, pieces of inscribed pots. So the sites need, to all these students out there on this call, the sites need a careful, rigorous hand to really think through what could be learned. And that work is only just beginning. And part of our project is intended to call attention to all the questions that have to be asked.
Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions from our participants, from our audience. You're welcome to place your questions in the chat, or feel free to come off of mute and ask questions using that raise hand function. I don't know if any of the speakers have questions for each other, but you're certainly welcome to pose them. Josephine, I know that when you and I talked about your presentation, we talked about the role of time in the research that you did with regard to the idea of these storage vessels serving this function to sort of resist time in a lot of ways, and thinking about how that connects to what Michael was talking about with regard to the idea of language as a form of poetics and resistance. So I wonder if, after thinking through this project, Josephine, from your vantage point with regard to the research that you've done, if you've thought a little bit more about what these jars represent in terms of different layers of time.
Yeah, so I think the biggest kind of awakening for me was when Ethan actually like tasked me to write a wall label for a part of this exhibit regarding the vessels, the stoneware, and it kind of made me think about that connection between the written word and kind of that very complex history of how enslaved workers were actually not taught to write or read, and just the realization that I am sitting here in the present working with these objects and I'm writing about them again. It struck me really deep because, you know, it's like, do I have the power to actually write about these in an effective way? And I think that's also why writing a wall label for this was really challenging for me. And so I think that are kind of, I guess, the ripples in time is still continuing, and which is why I really want to emphasize that these objects do live with us and they are witness to all the history that has occurred in the past and will continue to occur in the future.
That's great, thank you. And I wonder, Michael, picking up on that thread with regard to the relationship of time to language and the other way around, if we think about, well, for both you and for Ethan, when you think about the role that language plays not only in the objects and their histories and the ways in which they have catalyzed new levels of inquiry. But I also wonder if you might share with us some thoughts about the kinds of curatorial choices that you came up against with regard to how to present these objects when you're thinking about the role of the maker and the owner. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. You know, this project has pushed at conventions of museums and curatorial practice at every turn. And that's a good thing, I think. One of the points of conversation and debate, and one of the places where convention fails is in what we call the tombstone label. So the idea of the simple recording of artist, title, date, because with the exception of Dave, who you've heard a lot about, there were some 200 other people involved in the potteries, and we have their names. In fact, we'll be opening the show with their names in archives, in ledgers, recorded as values, these enslaved people. So we have all these names and we have all these pots, but it's virtually impossible to match one to the other, to attribute who, say Simon, like what he made, or what Lydia made. These are some of the names in the archive. And so we've thought a lot about how to responsibly deal with that problem. And a second problem, which is that the history of attribution and discussion about these objects since, say, the 1960s, often written by Southern scholars, and they've done a lot of great work, is to prioritize the name of the white factory owner. So that's a vessel made and marked Thomas Chandler or Colin Rhodes would be assigned to attributed to Thomas Chandler or Colin Rhodes, even though we've learned that they enslaved people and they had nothing to do with making the pots in the case of Colin Rhodes. And so we've tried to think about how do we responsibly refer to and rewrite that history. And you'll see our solution when you come see the show. But there's been, just a lot of conversation about practices of naming, practices of museum convention, and how they just don't necessarily work for this kind of material. So we've tried some new things and eager to hear what folks think when they come. I see a hand up, Dalia.
Yeah, I wonder if, Michael, do you want to address the question of language, and then we'll certainly be able to get to our questions.
Yeah, I think it was masterful what David did, whether intentional or not. But what he's done is made beautiful vessels that makes us cherish them. But while we cherish the vessels, we also cherish the language, right? Because they are part of the vessels. And if we continue to break down the language for what it really means, we can see it applicable to us, in the 21st century. But what's really interesting to me was Vincent Brown's article that's in the catalog. And he said, I wanted to, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I wanted to grab the vessel. I wanted to hold it up and feel its weight against my strength, but it gave me a shiver. And what that means to me is that there's a spirit, there's something that's contained in those vessels that, transcends their materiality, which is sort of what language is doing when it tells us all to repent, or we will be lost.
Definitely. Thank you. So I know we've got a couple questions in the chat, and I know one of our participants, Tony Green, has a hand up. So Tony, if you would like to come off of mute, you're welcome to ask your question.
Thank you. I'm curious as to how David how he learned how to write. How did that come about? I'm flawed that in 1834, and he could write so eloquently with beautiful handwriting. So I want to know if there's any insight into that. And then part two of the question is, how did the pottery get from 1834 to 2023? How did it come from there to the present? Like, who was somebody safe? I mean, does anybody know? I mean, they're in beautiful shape. They're gorgeous, they're lovely. So if anybody could address that.
Yeah, Michael, you want to take part one and I'll talk about part two, which is an amazing question.
Sure. So the scholarship says, as fate would have it, that David had two jobs. Not only was he enslaved at the pottery, but one of his enslavers owned a newspaper, and David was working at the newspaper. I presume he was hauling tubs of ink or reams of heavy reams of paper. But in any event, what we know is that he was around language. He was around letters. We're not saying for sure because we don't know if that's where he actually learned, but he was certainly in a position to understand language from being so close to that second job.
And as for the question about kind of how these things survive and why they're still here, because of course, ceramics is a fragile material, right?
Yes.
Even stoneware, which is the most
Yeah.
durable of ceramic bodies. So it's kind of like against the odds that they even survive. But I would say that, the first answer is just benign neglect. The objects are so large, weighing in at 100 pounds, capable of holding 28 gallons. They're not easy to move. And the histories of that we know, which are limited, are histories that describe these objects kind of languishing in smokehouses, as Josephine described, or on porches. There's one with found in a field with bullet holes in it. And in the 1930s, a group of museum people in Charleston started getting interested in collecting this material as a way of like commemorating the state craft history. They had no idea they were by enslaved makers at that point in the 30s. So it starts to enter museums, and you can graph the value. The exception of what I'm describing are the face vessels, which have were not benign neglect at all. They were very much cared for, and as I say, went north with families in the Great Migration, were safeguarded, passed through generations, buried in some cases. So they were very much cared for. But yeah, the pots are just kind of like benign neglect, I think, and we're fortunate, I guess, for that.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you. So there's a couple questions in the chat. One is for Michael. Michael, as you referred to David Drake's use of language with regard to the July 4th statement, could be considered as a strategy of double coding or double entendre. The language he used could be interpreted as either a celebration of July 4th or a call to rebellion, depending on one's position as a reader. This notion of speaking in double entendre is a common strategy in written text, spoken language, visual production, social performance, etc., among oppressed people.
I totally agree. He's what Henry Louis Gates talks about as signifying, right? We can't say what the actual intentions were because there's no way we can get inside of David's head. But a clue to understanding is simply looking at the context and look at the circumstances around which he was writing. So if we look really closely, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that particular poem was written in 1859. In 1859, there was also an attack on Harper's Ferry by John Brown. Now, did David know John Brown? Who knows? Was there rumors going around at the time that that was happening? But it's no coincidence that that text, that language went on a pot. And the pot, as I said before, it had a social biography. It went places. It interacted with people, usually enslaved people, because they handled the food in smokehouses and kitchens and so forth. So those are the people that were reading that. So in a way, was that a communication of some sort? We don't know, but it's certainly curious.
Definitely. And Michael, just as a quick follow-up, Stuart asks whether the sort of what we might call backslash markings in the pot in that particular poem might signify that doubling of meaning.
Very good speculation. Very good speculation.
It strikes me too that, and I wonder about the access that he may have had, not only when you're talking about the sort of language and words through the sort of avenue of journalism, but also in terms of timely events. You know, did he have an understanding of what was happening in terms of the news that was being published, whether it be about the slave codes or about rebellions in various areas?
But see, that conversation is right where it needs to be. This exhibition helps us look beyond the pots, right? The pots are there only, for me anyway, only to get us to look at sort of the deeper issues and conditions under which they were made. That's what it does for me. It gives me a sense of, it makes us have this whole discussion we're having today. We aren't necessarily talking about the aesthetics of the pot. We're not talking about how it was made. We're talking about meta issues, other things that it clues us into. And I think that's the value and beauty of this exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, to that point, considering how this exhibition has forced new considerations around museum conventions, I wonder, Ethan, if you might want to address a question that's come in the chat that says, now that we know David Drake's descendants, have museums thought about compensating them given the current value?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we're certainly beginning that conversation. In fact, it predates this project. In I think 2017, a potter named David Mack, who is involved in our audio guide and in our exhibition development, proposed to Congress a law called the Stolen Bones Act, which was about compensating the descendants of the potters really every time there was a sale of an Edgefield pot. So that's very much out there. That act has not gone anywhere, but we're starting to have this conversation about, yeah, what is the right and responsible move as custodians of these objects, now that we know who Dave's family is, and we didn't know that till 2016. So we can talk about how that all happened, but the conversation is very live. So and the relationship is, I think, just being built.
That's great, and points to the ways in which the stories continue to unravel in some really interesting ways around how we understand these objects now, and how that this is only the starting point, I think, for continuing.
Yeah, I haven't like, I'm no mathematician, but I find it interesting that the value of these objects when they were made in the 1850s, say, to the time, say, when the MFA acquired its pot in 1997, there was obviously a significant jump, but the jump from 1997 to 2020 is even greater. So the values, which is remarkable. So the values are fast. The market for these objects, as every museum tries to acquire poem jar and as the supply is dwindling, is fast. The market is fast increasing.
Super interesting. Michael, did you want to say something about that, or
No.
were you okay?
Just something just went through my head, because when Ethan was talking, I was just thinking, I think the last pot sold for 1.4 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Amazing. Thank you. We have another question, and then I have actually a question for you, Josephine, when we complete this one. But a question that's come into the chat is, as the pots went out with David's writing, how was the text engraved not caught? Because these went to other enslaved people, did the slave owners not check it over? In other words, how was that language that he inscribed that really bears his presence? How was that not seen as suspect?
Yeah, I mean, hard to say. I have my own theories about this. What I would say is that, and with the exception of some of the early pots where it's pretty faint, as Dave gets older, as his pots get bigger, you can't miss it. Like, it's so conspicuous. The engraving is deep. The words are big. There's like what we call swagger to them. His flourishing. So there's no way it like went unseen. It gets more and more conspicuous. Anyone who's seen the later pots can attest to that. My own sense is that really every potter in Edgefield upset all of our notions about the hierarchy of the plantation system, of the slave system, because they were like so skilled and gifted as potters, and the whole enterprise was so contingent on their skill and knowledge that they could kind of like they knew so much more than their so-called enslavers and owners. And Dave is a particular case of this. That my sense is, he knew that, and he talks about that in his poems, and he could kind of do what he wants. Now, that said, there is a 7-year interval in his life when he's owned by someone else, when he gets sold, and there's no poetry from that period. So not everyone thought the same way about this. But we can only, as with much of the history of this period and of the history of slavery, there's a lot of speculation.
And the other thing I think, just before Josephine speaks, is what he did with language, right? Unlike the slave narratives, which were clear in their critique, his was a poetic language. So poetry is an interesting use of language, because you can say what you want to say, but it's not exactly clear what you're saying. So, and then it also was read as cute, right? Oh, look, an enslaved person writing poetry. How cute. But I think the poetics were a way of sort of disguising the hidden transcript, what he was really saying, and it kept him out of hot water.
And by design meant to be, you never get to the bottom of the poem. There isn't always a clear answer. There is never, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah, they're endlessly interpretable. And to Michael and your point, yeah.
Uncontainable, you might say, yeah. I wonder, Josephine, when you're thinking about the kinds of questions that you were asking in terms of your research, I wonder if you could give us a little window into the kinds of sources that you visited and just how you went about doing your research. You were tasked with trying to understand more about these objects in terms of their original context, and how you went about doing your research.
Sure. So I think I started with Ethan's recommendation of High on the Hog. There's both a book and a documentary. And then through that, I realized that there's an entire field of culinary historians who dedicate their scholarship to studying kind of the African-American foodways, and also the foodways of the enslaved people. And Ethan also introduced me to Ghetto Gastro, who are contemporary chefs and there's still a lot of chefs who are working through this kind of history that is sometimes forgotten, that people don't realize what's on their dinner table was actually from this history. And I think just sitting in the library and flipping through books and newspaper archives, I was able to, I guess, compile this research.
It's really wonderful. And I love too that you were able to draw upon the kind of visual culture referring to Ration Day, and really put us in the context of understanding how these objects functioned on a utilitarian level as well. So yeah, thank you for that, Michael. And Michael, when you went about researching, I'm just curious now, when you went about researching David's poetry, you talk about contextualizing his words in sort of broader contexts around history and language. Were there some guiding questions that sort of shaped your research? Just things that you really
Yeah, the basic material culture questions, right? Rather than taking an object-centered approach, which is generally how one looks at material culture, you look at how it's made, what's the color, what's the glazing, you know, how much can it hold? You sort of begin to ask object-driven questions, and object-driven questions look at the context in which they were created. And once sort of I began to look at the context and understand that it was an enslaved context, another scholar informed my research, Michel Foucault. And one of the things that he said is, where there is power, there's resistance. And so understanding that concept, I was saying, well, oppressive power was clearly operative during that period. So where was the resistance? And that sort of got me looking at how David might have been resisting, which led to the language and the understanding of how poetry is sort of a way of critiquing without being explicit. And so it all came from this notion of looking at the context in which objects are created. And I think that's what informed most of the research.
That's really terrific. Well, I know I speak for many when I say we're really, really excited about the exhibition opening soon, thinking about installation. And I wonder if there aren't any other questions in the chat or perhaps among our audience, if each of you might be willing to share some general thoughts about what you hope visitors will gain from the exhibition. I know this is something we talk about internally quite often, but I'm just curious if each of you has thoughts about, as it gets closer to opening day, what you hope students, academic audiences, and just general visitors might gain from the exhibition. Anyone want to start? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about, I can start. You know, I think we tend to think about artistry and creativity on one side and duress and enslavement and doing something against your will on the other side. And I think what these pots continue really raise for me is the possibility that you can have creativity and expression, you've resistant expression under conditions of duress. And that those two things which we don't think can ever align are actually possibly you can align them. So that's one. And, you know, second, I think these objects bring us to a world of great sadness and trauma, but also a world of great joy. And Dave's poetries are always navigating both those currents. And I hope that people can share their own interpretations of the nuances of how he plays and speaks to both of those sides of the realities of his situation.
Thank you.
So I could say that when audiences come, I would just hope they would ask a simple question, and that is, what stories are these pots and jars telling? What's the story? You know, don't just stop at surface, but say, what are they leading us to understand? What are they telling us? What's the story?
Really powerful. Thank you.
I think as students, and maybe if there's also students here, outside of the classroom is a really rare opportunity to learn and engage with kind of things that we may learn in the classroom. And I think these objects really provide us with a legacy of endurance and survival, even trauma that we might have learned in our textbooks. And I think this is a real opportunity to kind of, I guess, contemplate on what our future generation might be able to do with these objects as well, since we are the younger generation. So I hope as students we could really, really engage with these objects in an effective way.
Thank you so much, Josephine. And on that note, we can all look with a lot of optimism toward the future around what's possible in thinking about these objects in a new light. And so I really am super grateful to all three of you for participating, to Sophia for her amazing help in putting together tonight's program. And we also do really value the input of our visitors and of our participants in programs, both in person and online. So welcome you to send us your thoughts about this program through a survey, which we can put out now, and we'll also follow up in an email. We do have time if there are any other questions that folks may have, and to offer an opportunity to come back together in some way, if there aren't any other questions. And Sophia's kindly put in the survey, in the chat, a link to a survey to share with us your thoughts. In the coming days, you'll expect to receive an email from learning@mfa.org with a copy of the evaluation in case you'd like to complete it, and some of the resources that we'll highlight around the link to the exhibition with future programs as well. We'll also share with you a little bit more about what we're doing with college and university students, and invite you to explore all of our offerings, both in person and online. And again, I want to thank our speakers for their generosity, their time at a very, very, very busy time for each of you as you prepare to open this exhibition. And Josephine, in the midst of a semester, we're really grateful for your time and your work on this project. So thank you all very much. And we hope you have a really terrific evening.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Thank you very much.
we'll see you on March 4th. Thank you.
Yes. Good night.